for wine. We must always de-stress with a little bit of alcohol. We would leave the size of the bottle up to you. I mean, if it was me, it's the full 1 liter. But I mean, everybody carries and handles liquor differently. You know, again, I'm Trinidadian, I'm blaming the fact that I'm trained. But good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying with us. Before we go right into this, let me just say 2 things. I am being asked to sit in a little bit so you can hear a different voice. And we're giving Carl a little bit of a break. She had a little hectic morning. We're going to go very quickly into panel 2, and because we only have 1 presentation in panel 2, here's what we're going. Yes. Guys, argue after. We protest more than after. But we're doing the 1 presentation from panel 2, and then I'm going to come back up and introduce panel 3. And what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that persons can write their questions for both panel 2 and 3. I think in the interest of time, let's finish panel 1, move to panel 3, and then at the end of panel 3, we'll do all the questions of panel 2 and 3. Does that sound good? Yeah? So it doesn't become monotonous and we don't miss the presentations of the panelists. Is that okay, guys? Yes. We're good? I'm hearing a yes. Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to go straight into it, and of course our presenter knows that he has 10 minutes, and I'm the timekeeper this time of panel. So let me welcome to you panel 2, and we're going to hear from the Anglican Church and decriminalization of the Global South perspective. And I would like to introduce to you Very Reverend Michael Weeder. He's from the Anglican Church of South Africa. So I'm going to hand over to you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And thanks to our inviting sister from Trinidad. Firstly, thank you very much for today's invitation. It's a very decent way of getting to the West Indies, and I didn't hesitate when it was hinted or guided in a very informal conversation with Winnie Vargas sometime in October last year. I must also say that I felt very at home in the pre-lunch conversation, dialogue, and it reminded me in many ways of many of our town meetings at home, vestry meetings, and also other dialogic engagements, the intensity and passion. The subject matter that we're dealing with and the deliberation that it's required reminded me as I was sitting next to a very raucous Father Mark. I must say it was him doing the smile Jamaica thing. But in the run-up to our 1994 elections, the country was really at a knife edge. And a lot of that awareness is absent from how, particularly our young people, look at Nelson Mandela, because he is regarded as having, in many ways, in the popular imagination, seen as failed to deliver. But at the same time, it's not an appreciation of the broader context. So I was working at some Columbia in Guguletu, one of our townships, outside, maybe 10, 15 minutes drive east of Cape Town. And on the weekend of running up to the Easter weekend, one of the much loved combatants of our struggle by the name of Chris Hani was assassinated by a white man from Eastern Europe. And I intentionally use race because that then amplified the situation and the tension. And it is Nelson Mandela that spoke into the context, saying that a white man killed one of our own, and yet it is a white woman who led the police to where this white fellow was arrested. And so you work very carefully with the reality of race, of fear, and of anxiety. And I remember driving to church on the day that we heard about the shooting and killing of Kasani. And we had a service just to gather the community. And 2 traditions of our liberation movement were present. There were young men and women and older ones of the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, and they stood with their arms raised like that and with the slogan, "He sees we're here to Africa. Africa belongs to us." And it was the 5 points of their program was indicated in the open palm. And then there were men and women, members of the African National Congress, the ANC, who stood with black power, strength, but it's also about unity. And they drew the fingers together in the clenched fist, believing that there was more power in the unity symbolized by the fist. And so I would stand there and we were singing Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, God bless Africa, with the palms, very angry people, mainly very angry men, and the clenched fist of solidarity. And I became aware of one mother of the Manana, of the Mothers Union. She stood like this, of the PAC and of the ANC. She was church in many ways. In many ways she was church in what we sought and what we needed. I want to greet you with a traditional Zulu greeting of my country. Sawubonani. Sawubonani, and your response is Yebo.
Yebo.
Sawubonani.
Yebo.
Which means we see you, we see each other. It means I recognize everything that you are beyond your identity of name and class and background, ethnic identity. But whenever I brought young people home as a youngster, my mom would want to know, who's your mother, what's your father doing? It was a necessary interrogation of familiarity, of relationships. It was being emphasized. Oh, your father used to work in epic industry, he was in the railways, you're great. And many times, friends coming to my house would learn about their family from my mother, as she took them around the routes of exploration, about who they are, where they came from, in what initially starts off in the house of a stranger, and they find that they are known and that they belong. So it is another way of saying you matter, we meet each other, however fleetingly, all along the way. Let these moments be weighed with respect, kindness, and mutual acceptance that God loves us all. I want to begin with a story and I want to end with a story. And I hope the time between the beginning story and the end story is a short space, but you know, in Africa, we take time to warm up.
Take your time.
It's taken me 2 days to get here, 2 days.
Take your time now, brother. Take your time.
I say amen to that. Amen. The story I want to first share is out of a film that was flighted in 2003 called Protest. It was a story that was inspired by a real event that happened in the 17th century when our country was occupied by the Dutch colonial powers, based largely in Cape Town. The settlement there, it served as a halfway point between the north, and as they went further, waiting out the trade winds to take them to the East Indies. So our story in that southern part is slavery into Africa. Into Africa, from the east, from South India initially, then the archipelago of Indonesia, Malaysia, and then eventually under the British from Madagascar, Mozambique, and sometime also from Angola. But this film is about 2 men that were incarcerated on Robben Island. One was a Dutch sailor by the name of Reichardt Jacobs, and a First Nation African man with the name of Klaas Blank, Reichardt and Klaas. So they were incarcerated in the Robben Island. I'm not quite sure how, for what reason they were there, but for years it has been, as a penal colony, Robben Island served their purpose. And while they were there, they entered into homosexual relationships. We brought them to trial. And the film is premised on that story from the court records of that time. They were found guilty of sodomy and executed in the prescribed format informed by the cruel ingenuity of colonial power. The bodies of Reichard and of Klaas were tied to concrete block, were taken by boat into the middle of the bay, Table Bay, and they were let down in the ocean. They drowned in that way. Jack Lewis, a South African director of Proteus, was participating in a panel discussion on the movie, and in reference to the title of the movie, Proteus said, and I quote, "I arrived at our interest in nomenclature through a coincidence of history." And the coincidence of history was, at that time, a flower called the Giant of the King Protea was named as such in 1735, the same year in which these two men were executed. Lewis adds, he says that the film explores the parallels between the cultivation of this particular flower species at the same time as a decade-long relationship of our prisoners, and it allowed us to mobilize the metaphors of binomial classification, and in a broader sense, the central question of naming that drove our story. And he says, what names could Klaas and Reichard have for each other, for their feelings, and for the sex they share? Incidentally, the film was made by various skilled individuals who self-identified as members of the queer community, and one of them was Noah Ben Asher, an Israeli queer legal theorist. And he said that the following insight when they saw the execution scene when the still live bodies were wrapped around the concrete and dropped into the ocean, and then see them slowly sink below the waves. He says here, when the sodomites disappear into the sea, it is analogous to the classification of people into races and of plant life into families of flowers. The process of naming is erotically charged, and its name becomes a subject of academia. And he says, fill in the blanks of racist, italic, homophobic desire. 2 minutes.
I'm sorry.
One more time, one more time.
Take your time, guys. Take your time.
So,
exception to the rule, all the way from South Africa.
thanks, brother. I should have brought this on red wine.
I will give you.
And for you, I should have brought a case.
I will say that I was just told that we're adding someone to this panel. So I'll give you 3 minutes to wrap up and then allow the other person. All right.
So much reference, and thank you very much, Trinidad. Much reference has been made to a ruling of our Constitutional Court. And so on the 9th of October 1998, the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and I quote, declared that the common law offense of sodomy is inconsistent with the Constitution of South Africa of 1996. And in a section headed, the treatment of differences in an open society, we read the following detail. Although the Constitution itself cannot destroy homophobic prejudice, it can require the elimination of public institutions which are based on and perpetuate such prejudice. From today, a section of the community can feel the equal concern and regard of the Constitution and enjoy lives less threatened, less lonely, and more dignified. The law catches up with an evolving social reality. So I'll depart from most of my text here and then just conclude what I need to do as a priest and as a pastor within my context. We have heard about the Indaba process and the process of necessary conversation. At the same time, when we looked at apartheid as a burning house, we often said, when your house is burning, it is not the time to discuss the aesthetics of the living room that you will prepare in the future. You deal with the fire. And those who are putting out the fire needs to work with agency and with urgency. And part of the genius of our Constitution and the wisdom of these findings was premised on the engagement of dialogue with the affected community. And that is a challenge to us as a church, because while we have this progressive ruling of our Constitution, we lag behind how the fact that when couples come to me that are now in a public union, I can't bless it. And so this is a story that I'd like to end with, to say that 2 years ago, I received a letter from a fellow in England saying that he and his partner would like to celebrate the 15th anniversary of their love commitment. And he recalls of how, as a member of our church choir, he stood in front of the Black Madonna where we light candles, and he prayed that God would send him a partner. And when he opened his eyes, there was this dashing young fellow next to him. And so he knew of my restriction. I couldn't bless the soul union. He said, I understand that, but could you ask if one of your clergy could be present while we recommit our vows? I said, I made sure that I was there on the Saturday of their choice. I had gotten one of our musicians to come along, sing something of Whitney Houston. She had some relationship problems, she never came. She came late. But I took the hand, let's call him Stephen John, and I said, look, I made sure that I had a witness. I said, I evoked the sentiment of Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor. I says that as a priest, I don't bestow any blessing on you. I only recognize what is already given divine within you. And so I took them by the hand and I stood in front of the Black Madonna, which they had stood 17 years ago, and I thank God for Steve in my right hand, John in my right. And I prayed. At what point it wasn't a blessing, the angels alone knows. But I think that presents us really with a deep challenge of contradictions that we will have to resolve, and it will be no easy road. It will not be a perfect, seamless contestation, because the cultural bias against the gay community within South Africa is immense. But again, those who have not the heavy filter of history and of bias against them, that are young people, young African men and women, are stepping forward and asserting that and claiming the truth of their identity, but they have to evict themselves from the township. At the same time, a contested category of humanity of the Madala, the older man, is stepping aside and making an often very common cause with these young people because they recognize them as their grandchildren. And it's the humanity that they see, independent and yet so fully part of their sexuality. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Michael. So I would like to invite Reverend Dr. George Zachariah from the Matuma Church to join us here at the head table so that you can do your presentation. We're also going to allow you 10 minutes. And just to remind folks and persons who came in during the presentations, we're following the same structure, guys. So what we're doing is Maurice is passing around with the paper so you can write your questions on there. We're collecting the questions. Because we have only 2 presentations with this panel number 2, we are going to take this panel and then we're going to move into panel 3. And at the end of panel 3, we're going to take the combined questions of panel 2 and 3. Just so that we're all on the same page. All right? Yeah. We're good? We're good?
Good afternoon, friends. The topic or the title of my presentation is Ecumenical and Interfaith Engagement with Sodomy Laws in India. We tend to think that homosexuality and homoeroticism are of recent origin in India. There is also a campaign that homosexuality is a Western import in India. In fact, homosexuality and homoeroticism have been practiced in India from time immemorial. Homosexual activity was never condemned or criminalized in ancient India. Such activities were tolerated as long as people fulfilled their societal expectations of marriage and procreation. Ancient Indian religious traditions also never condemned homosexual practices. The ancient Indian Sanskrit text, Kama Sutra, dwells on homoeroticism in sensual terms. Hindu and Jain temples from the medieval era have got several sculptures that depict homoeroticism. Even in Islam, we find the celebration of homoeroticism in Sufi poetry, music, and literature. This is the context in which the British colonizers arrived in India. As we know, colonialism has always been a theological project.
Amen.
As one of the colonial documents say, colonialism is not a question of interest, but a question of duty. It is necessary to colonize because there is moral obligation to employ the strengths they have received from Providence for the general good of humanity. The understanding of sexual morality of the British was deeply influenced by the Victorian morality and its interpretation of the Judeo-Christian scripture and theology. So the British colonial administration considered tolerance towards homosexuality as a social evil, and based on heteronormative principles, they initiated the mission of civilizing the heathens in India. In 1861, the British colonial administration imposed sodomy laws in India to purify and cure the Indians of their primitive and deviant sexual practices. We need to understand the imposition of sodomy laws in India and other colonies as a theological project, as the motive was to save and rescue the people who were perishing. We need to understand the sodomy law as legal cause of fascism. Section 377 provides the state the power to intervene, invade, regulate, and monitor even the intimate spheres of human life. It sanctions legally a regime of imperial gaze, where the people are always under the surveillance of the state. It reduces human body and sexuality into colonies that can be invaded, tamed, and redeemed, with the over display of abusive power by the law enforcement officers and the judiciary, and the covert violent interventions by the moral policing of the religious fanatics. What is Section 377? You are familiar with this definition, I don't want to get into it. There have been different campaigns in India and litigations to repeal Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. On July 2nd, 2009, in a historical verdict, the Delhi High Court repealed Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. If there is one constitutional tenet that can be said to be underlying theme of the Indian Constitution, it is that of inclusiveness. In our view, Indian constitutional law does not permit the statutory criminal law to be held captive by the popular misconceptions of who the LGBTs are. It cannot be forgotten that discrimination is antithesis of equality, and that it is the recognition of equality which will foster the dignity of every individual. However, the Supreme Court of India, in a verdict given in 2013, set aside the verdict of the Delhi High Court. We hold that Section 377 does not suffer from unconstitutionality, and the declaration made by the High Court is legally unsustainable. However, the competent legislature shall be free to consider the desirability and propriety of deleting Section 377 from the statute book or amend it. Recently, there is a new verdict from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of India on August 24, 2017 ruled that right to privacy is an intrinsic part of right to life and personal liberty under the Constitution. Discrete and insular minorities face grave dangers of discrimination for the simple reason that their views, beliefs, or way of life does not accord with the mainstream. Sexual orientation is an essential attribute of privacy. Discrimination against an individual on the basis of sexual orientation is deeply offensive to the dignity and self-worth of the individual. It is interesting to look at the responses of various religious traditions towards the issue of homosexuality and homoeroticism. This is what the Hindu guru Baba Ramdev said. The decision of the High Court, if allowed to sustain, will have catastrophic effects on the moral fabric of society and will jeopardize the institution of marriage itself. This offends the structure of Indian value system, Indian culture and traditions as derived from religious scriptures. It can be treated like any other congenital defect. Such tendencies can be treated by yoga, pranayama, and other meditational techniques. We see a similar response from the Muslim and other communities as well. This kind of thing does not happen among any creature except human beings. When human beings can differentiate right from wrong, why should humans run after such wrong things? We the Sikhs, the followers of Guru Granth Sahib, are saying no, no, and no. We are not going to allow in Sikh Dharma gay sex or gay marriage at all. God has made males and females of sex. Where does this new community come from? Many people don't know what gay sex is. When it comes to Indian Christian community, one can identify two dominant strands. For most of them, homosexuality is sin. Homosexuals should be criminalized. Section 377 should be retained in the Indian Penal Code. Homosexuality is an aberration and it can be cured through prayer and counseling. The second position is a qualified one. Love the sinner, hate the sin. The Roman Catholic Church does not approve homosexual behavior, but our stand has always been very clear. The Church has no serious objection with decriminalizing homosexuality between consenting adults. The Church has never considered homosexuals as criminals. This is the context in which the National Council of Churches in India took the leadership in organizing programs to address this issue. Soon after the Delhi High Court verdict repealing Section 377, we organized a roundtable to reflect upon the verdict theologically and biblically. Let me read from the statement of the roundtable. We recognize that there are people with different sexual orientations. Our faith affirmation that we are created in the image of God makes it imperative on us to reject systemic and personal attitudes of homophobia against sexual minorities. We consider the Delhi High Court verdict, which upholds the constitutional and human rights to privacy and a life of dignity and non-discrimination of all citizens, as a positive step. We envision church as a sanctuary to the ostracized, who thirst for understanding, friendship, love, companionship, and solidarity. We appeal the churches to sojourn with sexual minorities and their families without prejudice and discrimination, to provide them ministries of love, compassionate care, and justice. We request the National Council of Churches in India and its member churches to initiate an in-depth theological study on human sexuality for better discernment of God's purpose for us. We also felt the need for interfaith coalitions to campaign against homophobia. So an interfaith roundtable was organized. The statement of Interfaith Roundtable affirms that we commit ourselves to critically engage with our belief systems and practices, to review and reread scriptures and moral codes that stigmatize and demonize people who are different from us. We condemn homophobia and bigotry as morally unacceptable and commit ourselves to eradicate this sin from our religious communities. We pledge to accompany friends who are stigmatized and criminalized due to their sexual orientations and to provide them fellowship and solidarity in the struggle to love and live with dignity. We commit ourselves to transform our worship places, to welcome and provide safe spaces for sexual minorities. We discern the need to reclaim and reinterpret our traditions and rituals, festivals and feasts, scriptures and practices to liberate our religions from the shackles of ideologies of exclusion, such as patriarchy, casteism, and homophobia. We dedicate ourselves to safeguard the rights of all sexual minorities and to join hands with civil society initiatives to decriminalize homosexuality and to eradicate homophobia. We call upon religious leaders to condemn homophobia and to practice non-discriminatory hiring policies in their institutions, and also to follow affirmative action to end the discrimination that transgender people face in admissions and appointments. We affirm our resolve to work tirelessly to create a new world of compassion, justice, inclusivity, and acceptance, where the divine gift of sexuality will be celebrated in all diverse manifestations of affirmative love. The NCCI and other ecumenical movements brought out several publications during the last decade to create awareness among the congregations against homophobia and transphobia. You can see Vinny's book down here, Devil of Faith, Church and Friends, where do we go from here? So that's a big question that we are confronting today. We are committed to continue this struggle as followers of the non-conformist Christ, the one who consistently quarreled with the priests of public morality. Our call is to reject all laws that demonize, criminalize, and exclude human beings based on the dominant constructions of normativity and natural order. Thank you.
So, friends, colleagues, loved ones, brothers and sisters, as we agreed earlier, we're going to move into our next panel, which is panel 3. I want to encourage 2 things. I want you to please not forget your questions from this panel, because I'm sure we have questions. So Maurice is walking around with blank paper. Please write your question there. But the second thing is, you know, in Jamaica, we have a phrase, and my Jamaican friends and colleagues can help me out here because I haven't mastered the art of patois very well. But you know, we say we hold our reason. Yeah? And many times we know that we don't agree and we always disagree and we have different opinions, and that is great. That is healthy for engagement and dialogue. And I was so heartened that I sat at lunch and I heard persons holding a reason, sitting at the table and discussing, and sitting and not quarreling or arguing, but discussing and really opening up to hear from each other. And I was very heartened for that. So in the spirit of continuing with respect and love and kindness and open engagement, I'm going to ask that we continue in that, and with that in mind, as we go into the other panelists, if you have a question, please take a paper and write it. We will come around and collect it. I am sure, just as in other forums, it is very difficult to do presentations, but we must respect the presenters that are up here.
Yes?
Yes?
Yes.
All right, great. So if I can welcome, and guys, again, I'm blaming my Trinidadian accent. If I miss...
Please also ask our loved ones. It's Jesus who allowed us to be able to hear.
Okay, so in a democracy, in a democratic room that we're in, we're asking for us to write the questions, guys, because everybody wants to hear, everybody wants to listen to what the presenters are saying and to be able to internalize and process what they're saying, all right? Charlie Major Campbell is telling me he's not my accent is wrong, that's why I can't pronounce names properly. So moving right along, on to panel 3. On to panel 3. So we have 6 panelists on panel 3, and the theme for panel 3 is of the churches and decriminalization. And we're hearing from the global north perspective, guys. I'm giving you the opportunity to walk up here, okay? And for those of you who have not really gone through your program, this is very useful because you get not just the bio of persons who are speaking, but you're also on page 10 able to follow what each panel is meant to discuss. So I'm just going to quickly read what's here. So this particular panel, we know there's a wide array of Christian churches across the Commonwealth that hold different beliefs on criminalization of private consensual same-gender intimacy. This particular panel and the 6 panels that we have will seek to create a dialogue that includes these important voices from the global north. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you Reverend Basil Coward from United Church of Canada, Mr. Francis De Bernardo from New Ways Ministry, Reverend Dr. Sherry DeNovo from United Church of Canada, Reverend Dr. Robert Griffin from Metropolitan Community Church, Dr. Keisha McKenzie from the Seventh-day Adventist, and Dr. Matthew Waits from University of Glasgow. I'm going to ask colleagues if this is okay with you that we follow the order here. Yeah? So I'm going to start off with Rev Basil, and we have 10 minutes and I'll give you the timing. Okay? Thank you. Don't forget to write your questions, guys.
Good afternoon. My name is Basil Coward, and it's good to be here.
Amen.
And it's difficult to be here. The original plan was to reflect on the United Church of Canada's process towards affirmation and inclusion of people of all sexual orientation and gender identities. But I have diverted.
Take it out.
There are 3 things that do not coexist harmoniously: Blackness, queerness, and Christianity. And yet I embody all 3. These intersecting identities are more obvious if you take a look at where I spend my days. You'll find me at the front of the church, where I've served in ministry with congregations for 25 years, currently serving Victoria Square United Church in Markham, Ontario. You will find me at George Brown College in Toronto, where I work as faculty, talking to students who find themselves marginalized from many communities, including communities of faith. You'll find me hanging around the beaches of Barbados, my first home, where my roots run deep. And you'll find me walking along Church Street, the gay village in Toronto, where when gayness wrapped herself around me and drew me close in a tender embrace, I initially pushed her away, but have now come to hold her with exuberance because, especially because, my own experience and comfort and philosophical expansion involved letting go of the church's dogma around sexual orientation, but not around love. It arises from how I experience myself as known by God, above and beyond any fairy tales about God. And it deepens through how costly and valuable this has been for me as a Black man who has known such troubles. And because I finally know that any interpretation of Scripture that could generate self-loathing in any precious Black queer person is illegitimate. So here are 2 stories. Last week I was in Edmonton at the Network of Black Clergy of the United Church of Canada, which is an annual gathering that meets in our struggle for voice and for recognition in a church that often prefers not to see us. And at that gathering, a Black young man said to me, "I live in a world where my body is not safe anywhere, including the church, and I am exhausted with the struggle." And you and I know that in light of our current news cycle, that can be extended to all Black bodies.
Amen. Amen.
So a quick word here about a current project that I am involved with, entitled wouldn't it be nice to take my whole body to church? The embodied struggle for spiritual wholeness of Black queer folks of Caribbean descent in Toronto. And the core question being, how have Black folks experienced welcome or not from affirming congregations over the last decade? Because anecdotally, we know that Black queer folks have not always received welcome from affirming United Church congregations in the Toronto area. Back to Edmonton. With that Black young queer man, I engaged conversation about the objectification of his body, of our bodies. We commiserated about our experiences of homophobia and the claims that others still lay over our bodies. We talked of our anger, and we spoke about our pleasure. Here is a second story. This summer in Barbados, I spent the first 3 days of my holiday with my nephews and niece, and a little friend of theirs. On day 4, the 4 of them showed up at my door yet again. This time, their friend stood sulking in the doorway, and none of them could entice him to come into the place where he had been comfortable for the 3 days prior, and where I was the playful, friendly uncle of his friends. Now, instead, his stares, his sly, distrustful eyes, because his mother said to him that I was a bullet, a bad man, a fag. His grandfather, a respectable stalwart within the community, confirmed that indeed I was a dirty bullet. And he was commanded not to come to my family's home again. So this precious 7 or 8-year-old is whispering to his friends all the while, keeping an eye on me to ensure that I was not hearing, because after all, he did not want to hurt me. That was not an experience with me. And something happened that day that was deeply, deeply, deeply disturbing to me, and to that child, and to my niece and nephews. I wish that I could stand and could proclaim that the vilification, the dehumanization, the devaluation, and the emasculation of my identity no longer delivers a sudden punch, leaving me gasping for breath because it occurs so often. But that would not be true. Each time it occurs, it hurts like hell. It pierces. And that day, my fragile heart was pierced thrice. First, for my darling nephews and niece, who tried so valiantly to defend me, to speak of their experience with me. The dagger plunged again for the precious, precious little boy. The dagger plunged a 3rd time into the heart of the little boy who cowers inside of me each time he encounters dehumanization. Bishop Holder, I spent the last few days in Barbados on my holiday pondering what the message to that little boy might have been from his godly grandfather and mother who happened to be members of your flock. Now, I'm not blaming you for the sin of all of your flock. Not at all. I have lived long enough to know better. I also know truth is that these are deeply, deeply, deeply complicated moments with no villains, none whatsoever within them. Maybe there are few heroes. That little boy for returning the next day, even though he was commanded not to, and my nephews and niece. Still I wonder what that conversation could have been if Mom and Granddad had elevated their best selves and at least affirmed my fundamental right not to be discriminated against. Still, I wonder what the conversation in Barbados will be in the next decade. Sure, we need time for this. Still, I wonder my role in that conversation as a Beijing Torontonian. Here's the last word. Something, someone divine remains with me and cradles me and animates all of me and grounds my fragile faith. So these days, I've landed in a safe place. I commit to continuing this struggle so that queer folks, particularly Black queer folks, are able to land in a safe space too. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be among such an august group of presenters who have been so passionately working to end oppression against LGBT people, which is too often fueled by incorrect understandings of religious ideas. My name is Francis DiBernardo. I'm from the United States, where I serve as the Executive Director of New Ways Ministry, a national Roman Catholic ministry of justice and reconciliation, which tries to build bridges between the LGBT community and the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm here to bring you greetings and a report from across the Tiber.
Amen. Amen.
I would like to briefly present some thoughts about Roman Catholic tradition and how some of its leaders have used the tradition to both support and oppose criminalization laws, a very schizophrenic situation. I will first give you a little theology, second, an analysis of the current hierarchical atmosphere, and finally, at the end, some few hopes for the future. The reason that some Roman Catholic leaders have taken opposite positions about criminalization laws is because my church's discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity is influenced by two moral traditions which sometimes come into conflict with each other: the social justice tradition and the sexual ethics tradition. Briefly, the Catholic social justice tradition promotes the idea that the human dignity of all people, regardless of their state or condition in life, deserves respect and protection by law and by actions. All people are considered equal in dignity, with those who are poor or marginalized deserving the Church's preferential treatment. Catholic Church documents have acknowledged this tradition applies to the situation of LGBT people, particularly in situations where their human rights are denied. In fact, in 2008, the Vatican's representative to the UN General Assembly said that the Holy See, quote, continues to advocate that every sign of unjust discrimination towards homosexual persons should be avoided and urges states to do away with criminal penalties against them, unquote. But LGBT issues in Catholicism are also considered through the lens of the Church's sexual ethics tradition, which states that all human beings are either male or female, that procreative possibility is essential for all sexual activity, and that sexual activity is permitted only within the context of heterosexual marriage. So it comes down to this: how does a church leader respect the human rights of LGBT people while not appearing to approve of sexual activity that the church condemns? Which tradition should govern this topic. For some bishops, this is not a problem at all. But too often, other Catholic leaders have urged shamefully prizing the sexual ethic tradition over the social justice tradition. And so they have remained silent, complicit, and even at times supportive of laws that criminalize LGBT people. But if a balance existed between these two traditions, then we should see Catholic leaders defending the human rights of LGBT folks with the same vigor and forthrightness that they defend traditional heterosexual marriage. So why don't they? Besides the homophobia and transphobia that still plagues much of the Catholic hierarchy, some other forces are also at work. In 2015, I received press credentials to cover the Vatican Synod on the Family, an international gathering of bishops in Rome to discuss sexuality, marriage, and the family. At a press conference there, I addressed Archbishop Charles Palmer Buckle, the Archbishop of Accra in Ghana. And I pointed out to him that while many African bishops have spoken vocally against marriage for lesbian and gay couples, many fewer have spoken as vocally against criminalization laws against gay and lesbian people. So I asked him, do you think that the African bishops, or indeed any bishops at the Synod, would support a statement from the Synod condemning the criminalization of lesbian and gay people? He answered by saying, a sticking point for bishops on LGBT issues is the refusal of foreign governments and foundations to send humanitarian aid unless marriage equality laws were passed. Sadly, the Archbishop and his confreres believe that notion, even though it is not true. Indeed, many bishops maintain that promoting LGBT equality is a threat to their national sovereignty. I also spoke with Cardinal Peter Turkson, the president of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace at the Vatican. His position on criminalization laws had been very ambiguous. When I asked him to clarify his position for me, his answer was similar to Palmer Buckle's. He said, quote, my position has had two parts. Homosexuals cannot be criminalized. Neither can any state be victimized. So let no state criminalize homosexuals, but let no state be victimized. No state should have aid denied because of this. So the untruth persists, and bishops too often have allowed this falsehood to prevent them from speaking up for LGBT rights, lest they appear to be bowing to foreign pressures. Another factor influencing the Catholic discussion on criminalization is the so-called Francis effect, meaning a new spirit of openness about LGBT issues in the Catholic Church that has developed since the papacy of Pope Francis began in 2013. The Pope's new discourse is indeed a major step forward. However, this new discourse is still very far away from entering into the political discussions of LGBT human rights. For example, when Pope Francis visited Uganda in November 2015, he did not make any statement about the bleak legal situation of LGBT people in that predominantly Catholic nation. Though he spoke out against oppression in the other countries where he visited, he did not directly name LGBT oppression. In a similar vein, Cardinal Turkson echoed the Pope's reserve on this issue when I asked him, what would he say to politicians who supported criminalization laws? Turkson's answer, quote, I don't think that we should be condemning anybody. People need to grow, unquote. That kind of sympathy for politicians is never evident in Catholic hierarchical statements on issues like abortion and birth control. Another dimension of the Francis effect has been the Pope's move to decentralize church authority away from the Vatican and out to local bishops. While such a policy allows for better decision-making on many church matters, in regard to criminalization laws, it allows local ignorance and fear to perpetuate injustices. So in this vague and ambiguous ecclesial environment, we have seen Roman Catholic bishops in Malawi, Uganda, Cameroon, and Nigeria supporting criminalization laws. And in other situations, including here in Jamaica, under the previous Archbishop of Kingston, bishops have refused to speak out against them. But still there is room for hope, thanks to some brave and leaders and individuals. In India, where the idea of criminalization was reintroduced in 2013, Cardinal Oswald Gracious, the president of the Indian Catholic Bishops' Conference, was the only religious leader in India to speak out opposing such a possibility. Similarly, Bishop Gabriel Malzer of the nearby island of Dominica said that his diocese affirmed the idea that free sexual acts between adult persons must not be treated as crimes by civil authorities. And there have been many, many more. The Catholic bishops of South Africa, Botswana, Swaziland, Ghana, the Apostolic Nuncio to Kenya, the Apostolic Nuncio to Uganda, the Peace and Justice Commission of the Archdiocese of São Paulo, Brazil, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, and a group of US Catholic theologians. My own organization, New Ways Ministry, launched the hashtag Pope Speak Out Twitter campaign. Whenever criminalization laws become news, we ask our supporters on social media to tweet direct messages to the Pope to ask him to speak out against these injustices. On our daily blog, we have a category on criminalization laws, which covers, for the past 6 years, any incidents of Roman Catholic leaders speaking out for or against these laws. In closing, I'd like to say that in its Catholic social justice tradition, Roman Catholicism has the tools to oppose criminalization laws against LGBT people. No doctrinal argument prevents bishops from speaking out, and in fact, our tradition actually compels them to do so. Catholic leaders should defend LGBT human rights because these leaders are Catholic, not in spite of their Catholic identity. Amen. Catholic bishops need to live up to the best ideals of our tradition, move past homophobia and transphobia and bad information, so that they can help to build the reign of God on earth, where all are equal and free. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say a great shout of Thanksgiving and thanks to Maurice Tomlinson for organizing us, and to the Anglican Church for their courage and faith in bringing us all here. So let's hear it for them. When I was first ordained, which was many, many years ago, and I wore this collar for the first time and walked down Main Street in Toronto, a lovely little old man came up to me and said, "Good afternoon, Father." And I have to tell you that in that moment, I mean, I always knew I was queer. I knew that from being a little girl, being chased home from school and being called dyke, and all that goes along with growing up queer in a not queer positive world. And I'd been Christian for a number of years at that point, but it was really in that moment that I knew I was a queer Christian. And that's what I considered myself. And I consider Christianity to be a queer, positive religion, and that's why I'm standing here today. I've had great good fortune. I walked into a church in 1988 called the United Church of Canada, which is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, that at that point took a very brave stand and ordained openly gay and lesbian people. And a third of their congregants left the church, and I walked in. And many others like me walked in the doors and still do. When I took over my church in a downtown West End parish, it was a dying church. That's the only reason I got the job. They had 2 years left of life. And so I made it my mission to build that church up on an inclusive basis. And there I had the privilege and the pleasure of performing the first legalized same-sex marriage in Canada. I say in North America, I've been proved wrong. 2 women of color, by the way, were those 2 individuals. And we did it by reading the banns, an ancient Christian tradition. So we didn't have to take them to City Hall and get refused for a license theirs before the laws changed in Canada. So we read the banns in our church. Our congregation went along with it. Needless to say, I was the one in the pulpit. And we sent it in to the registrar's office in Ontario, and lo and behold, the Holy Spirit was at work, and the clerk read the name Paula, P-A-U-L-A, as being a man's name. It didn't say male or female on the form, it said bride and groom, and vetted it. Yay! So the Toronto Star, which is the biggest daily in Canada, and the CBC, the biggest television station in Canada, and a very good lawyer, all rose to the occasion, saved me from losing my license in that instance, and lo and behold, we had made history on that day. It was very exciting. I have to say, sadly, my church didn't back me up, but as I said, it helps to have a good lawyer at the CBC on your side. Because of that, and because of other moves we made in that congregation, we ended up having 1,000 people attend on Christmas Eve. And that church still exists today. I wrote a book about it called Queering Evangelism that won the Lambda in Washington, D.C., about building a church based on inclusion and how, yes, you can get bums in pews based on inclusion, not on exclusion. And by doing it, following biblical theology and being faithful every step of the way. And because of that, a political party asked me if I'd consider running for government because they thought I could win because I had a high profile in my community, and they were right, and I did, and I have spent the last 11 years as a politician in Ontario, where we have 13 million people, and I represent about 120,000 of them in my district in downtown West End, Toronto. And again, why? Because I'm queer, and because I built an inclusive church. So I'm privileged, I get it. But I've also been at it for 40 years. So in 1971, I was part of that demonstration you saw earlier today on Parliament Hill. And when I was a little kid, as I said, I was chased home from school with boys who threw rocks at me. I've had death threats, I've been trolled, I've seen very good friends die, many others commit suicide. And I wanted to talk about a group of people, before I tell you what I've done since being in political office, that hasn't been mentioned very much yet today, and that's children. The safety of our children. Amen. To raise our children in a safe world. And I can tell you, whatever we do in these conferences, whatever laws we pass or don't pass, whatever we take theologically, whatever we think sin to be or not to be, 2 to 10% of our children will grow up to be LGBTQ, and in Canada we say 2S, two-spirited, in honor of our First Nations people who have always had trans people in their midst and honored them. So no matter what we do, these children, our children, and I'm a mother, will exist and they will grow up. And we have choices to make about their safety, because right now, I can tell you, even in Ontario, where we have some of the most progressive laws in North America, trans children are at risk. About 50% of them will attempt suicide or be met with violence from others. About 50% of them will live in poverty all their days. LGBTQ children are highest at risk for suicide and homelessness in high school. I was one of them. That is the fate of our children. These are our children. And so it's our decision how we'll look after them. And the Bible tells us we should love them. And we should love all of our children, including our queer children. So I hold that up for you, because to me, it's about saving lives. I'm here because I hope to be able to save lives. So getting back to my political days. So what did we manage to do in political office? Well, first of all, many, many times, it took many, many years, I tabled a law called Toby's Law. And Toby's Law is named after my music director at my church, who was trans. Toby died by an overdose. And we erected the stained glass window of Toby at the piano in our sanctuary. And I said at Toby's funeral, I said, we're probably the only church in Christendom that has a stained glass window of a trans person in their sanctuary. And somebody yelled out, what about Joan of Arc? And I said, yeah, indeed. What about St. Joan of Arc?
Not playing the piano, though.
That's true. Probably not. So I worked on Toby's Law. Toby's Law added gender identity and gender expression to the Ontario Human Rights Code. It took us a good 5 years and many tablings to get all party support on that. Even the most conservative members voted for that law. That is now the law in, it wasn't the first jurisdiction of the size in North America to pass a law like that. Now it is the law in Canada. We also in 2015 passed a law banning conversion therapy. Got that one done in 2 months. And shortly thereafter, I don't pretend that he was inspired by this. We were the first to get in North America, but then President Obama said he supported banning conversion therapy. It was good timing. And so that happened. Again, why any of this? To save lives. Parent equality in 2016, because even with the change of the laws that we had accomplished out of my office, which, by the way, and that's not me alone, never is, a group of incredibly dedicated activists, of course, an army of them behind me, passed parent equality, because even with the changes of laws, we found that queer couples were still having to adopt their own children. So we changed that. And then finally this fall, I hope it will be my swan song bill, because I'm leaving politics to go back into ministry in January after 4 elections in 11 years. But we're going to pass Trans Day of Remembrance. We've already acknowledged this in the Parliament, where once a year in November we stand and have a moment of silence for all of those trans folk who have died the previous year, and it's always in the hundreds, So that's what we've done over the last 11 years in Parliament. And as I say, we've accomplished that with a small army of activists, with the support of the general population of our province, which is almost half of Canada when you look at the population of it, and with an incredible amount of prayer and support. And I want to leave you with a couple of theological points. I listened with rapt interest to the Archbishop with his keynote earlier. One of the theological passages we always heralded in our queer positive congregation that grew and grew was the very first Christian conversion story in Acts. The very first Christian conversion story in Acts is, guess what? A queer person of color, the Ethiopian eunuch. And I advise you all to look at the Rembrandt painting of that moment, because as Jesus said, there are different kinds of eunuchs. There are those who are forcibly, of course, castrated, but there were the other couple of thirds of them who chose to become eunuchs and who didn't go the surgical route. It's not quite the way Jesus said it, but who obviously chose not to be heterosexual. In other words, queer folk. The very first convert in Christianity was a queer person of color, and Philip did not want to baptize them. Philip did not want to baptize them because Philip saw them as sexually unclean. And how did that eunuch convince Philip to baptize them? By being biblically literate. So, there's not a message in that for the rest of us. He quoted scripture to Philip, and Philip said, wow, you know it better than I do. Okay, we're going to do this thing. So please uphold that. And the other thing that we used to ring with is those famous binary smashing words of St. Paul. In Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, no male nor female, no slave nor free, and guess what I would add? No queer nor straight. That is our tradition, folks. That is our queer, positive Christianity. We don't have to go around talking about those passages that seem to condemn Christianity. We should be talking about those passages that uphold queers in Christianity. Jesus never said a word about homosexuality, but Jesus did say, love one another as I have loved you. And he did say, love your neighbor as yourself, and he never qualified who that neighbor was. Thank you.
So let me just take this opportunity to remind everyone in the room, we are creating, and as Rev Sherry said it, I'm going to quote you a little bit here, we are engaging in discussion, we're opening up the dialogue, we're in a space of inclusivity. I know that perhaps for some of us it is very difficult for us to keep our thoughts to ourselves, but I'm encouraging us to take the pages from Maurice. You can take 5. Please write your comments and questions there. I am gently reminding us that in the spirit of respect, we cannot and should not allow each other to be shouting through presentations. It is very distracting, very disrespectful, and I think that if the tables were turned and anyone else was up here, we wouldn't like that for ourselves. I am asking in the spirit of respect. Please.
Amen.
Good afternoon. Oh, it's that time of the afternoon, I can tell. So this is what I want us to do. If you would you just please rise as you are able for just a moment. Rise as you're able for just a moment and turn to someone and say these words. I make a difference.
I make a difference.
Oh, come on, you can do better than that. I make a difference. And I want you to say that you make a difference. And together we can make our world difference. Okay, you can sit back down. Hopefully they got that lunch readjusted just a little bit. Got us just refocus for just a moment. But I want to first of all say thank you to Maurice for the invitation and the committee to be here. When my invitation came, it also came with a wealth of invitations that followed of saying, please, please, please come and do this with us. So I want to say thank you to him and to the committee for inviting me to be here today. Secondly, I want to say that we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of something that's wonderful. And the funny part about the celebration is in a couple of days, I will be 50 years old. So when I thought about what is being celebrated in my turning 50, it's like, this is something that has happened my lifetime. And when I put that in context of the work that we're still doing, it just reminds me that there's still so much work yet to be done. From 2006 to 2011, I traveled to Jamaica on behalf of the Sunshine Cathedral in Fort Lauderdale and the Metropolitan Community Churches and for the Global Justice Institute. And I'm here today representing Sunshine Cathedral and the Global Justice Institute. And from my time of traveling here between 2006 and 2011, I was here so often during that period of time, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice a month, that a group of my friends got together here in Jamaica and they deemed me an honorary Jamaican.
Amen.
I never heard of such a thing. I don't know if they made it up. Maybe they did, I don't know. But I will say it is good to be home again.
Amen.
Woo! My travels to Jamaica over the years were to work with individuals in the lesbian, gay, and bisexual transgender community and their allies, to offer spiritual hope and support and encouragement to the LGBT community, people of faith. I was representing a spiritual movement that affirms the dignity and the sacred value of all people. Sacred value of all people that does not discriminate against anyone. And as a person of faith and a humanitarian, I tried to express oppositions to violence against the LGBT people. Individuals living in Jamaica found themselves in danger simply because they identified as gay or were thought to be gay. They needed support, and I was one of the many people who was trying to offer that support and care of great concern. In those days, there were constant reports of people suspected of being gay, being chased down, threatened, terrorized, and even brutally killed. The media at one point carried a story of an Easter Sunday funeral of a gay person, and while the funeral was taking place, the church was attacked and the congregation had to flee. Some of you here maybe remember that incident.
Yeah.
And there was many other such stories like that. So returning to Jamaica brings these memories back to mind. And I remember meeting with people who were hiding the truth of their lives. I remember meeting activists who risked their safety to combat homophobia. I remember meeting journalists and theologians and politicians and students, people seeking asylum, people living with HIV and AIDS. I still care about those dear people, and I still care about Jamaica, and I still remember the stories. And we can do nothing else. If we can do nothing else, we must maintain hope for those stories that we know and for those stories that are forever silenced through acts of violence. There is a musical group in the United States called Sweet Honey and the Rock. You're familiar with them?
Yeah.
And one of their many songs is one that is called Ella's Song. And it includes the lyric which says, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." Sodomy laws and other oppressive political and practices and attitudes that dehumanize any group of any community of people must be challenged. And everyone who is willing and is able to stand up for people who are living in the same gender loving relationship and people who are willing to not break down because of oppressive rules and regulations or even oppressive religious beliefs must stand up and continue to believe in that line of the lyric. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. All people, all members of the human family are children of God and deserve to be safe, to live lives of dignity, and to be offered equal opportunity and equal protection, because we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until there is a full repeal of all anti-sodomy laws globally. In a world where dozens of countries now have marriage equality, it doesn't make sense for other countries to criminalize relations between same consenting individuals. And the church that has too often spread hate in the name of an all-loving God should repent. When the church abandons violence and bigotry, society will likely follow in their footsteps. For the betterment of humankind, it is time for church and for state to recognize and affirm the dignity of all people, including gay and lesbian people. I say this even though recently, in my country, the United States, was one of just 13 countries to have voted against a United Nations resolution condemning the death penalty for people in same-sex relationships. And I continue to work within my own country and my own community to challenge such deadly attitudes and unfair policies. Because wherever we are, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The reality is that not only do anti-sodomy laws unfairly target and penalize same gender-loving people, but they also reinforce homophobic attitudes that leads to violence against gay people. The damage that they don't stop here is that such laws also tend to keep people from seeking needed medical care in an attempt to hide their sexuality. Many may not seek help for certain stigmatized infections, and if they are diagnosed and treated for their diseases, their health even suffers. And in multiple ways, anti-sodomy laws can harm and even destroy lives. And ending anti-sodomy laws will save lives. And we who believe in freedom cannot rest until these laws are passed globally. So I want to sum up my talk with 3 open-ended questions and challenges for you. What is the opportunity before us today to challenge anti-sodomy laws? What is the role of the church in this movement? And where do we go from here? I believe in asking more questions than giving more answers, because it's in a dialogue of seeking to find common ground can we truly move forward to a better world for all people. And whatever our answer to these additional questions, I conclude with this hope. May we all be free of the pain caused by sodomy laws and of the oppression motivated by homophobia. And I leave with you the profound words of Ella's song: we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Amen.
Good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon.
My name is Keisha McKenzie. This conference has produced an exciting, if unsettling, week for the local Adventist Jamaican Church.
Amen.
And for reporters at the Gleaner and Observer who are unclear about several facts. So I'll introduce myself as a child of Jamaicans, one who graduated with the highest honors from Northern Caribbean University, and a Seventh-day Adventist. What I'm not is an employee of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination in Jamaica or anywhere else in the world, which frees me to be an active and engaged member of Adventist congregations and the wider lay Adventist community and an Adventist in communities beyond the church, like this one. The local Adventist church administration chose to be missing in action this week, but as I think the organizers of this conference realize, the footprint of the Adventist church in Jamaica, between a governor general, a prime minister, one of the 3 largest universities in the country, and a multitude of civil service leaders and others of influence, is simply too large for there to be an empty Adventist chair in this room.
Amen.
So just for the next 2 days, I'm going to sit in the chair and hope that perhaps paid church employees will be able to sit in that chair next time. I will not be, thank you. I will not be speaking for the church corporation at any time. I'm not going to debate the church's statements, faith statements. But what I will do is to quote from or reference statements from Adventist spokespersons, employees, lawyers, theologians, pastors, lay members like myself, as well as several other open access sources that are available to any of you, just as they're available to me. And at the outset, I'd say that discussing sex and sexuality and identity and faith exclusively through a legal lens means that on topics like how humans know themselves, how we connect with each other, how we honor God, real people get left out of that. And focusing on law and policy to the diminishment of people while failing to name rape or abuse as such, conflating relationships of mutual care with abuse or criminal acts, all these things overshadow the impact of generalized stigma and discrimination on ordinary people and their family systems. So, there is a legal and social legacy of sodomy laws, or so-called sodomy laws, here and around the world. And I believe our respective religions bear significant responsibility for that impact. As my colleagues in Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and other African states have explained directly to me, that legacy turns visible LGBTQIA people from contributing and respectable members of society into a troubled category of unapprehended criminals. And I've argued recently that beliefs have real-world consequences for real-life people. And real-life consequences can be measured. Permitting discrimination and marginalization for one group creates vulnerabilities for all groups. So I'm coming to the conference with a lot of curiosity about the wider context for how my religious community has engaged the LGBTQIA community. As I've explored the church's papers and statements, I've realized that the Adventist approach to the lives of LGBTQIA people is rooted in our historical approaches to religious and civic law. Over its 154-year history, the Adventist denomination has engaged in religious liberty and civic activism. And as it's done so, it's acted on the principle that the church has one appropriate lane of authority, the state has another appropriate lane, a separate and distinct lane, and the church should carefully monitor those lanes so as to prevent state interference in religious matters and religious tyranny or improper influence on individual conscience and on minority populations. I like how General Conference President Ted N.C. Wilson defined this in 2013. He defined it as keeping the church at arm's length from the state. According to Wilson, the principle of religious liberty precludes the Adventist Church from accepting the belief that any nation state rests on Christianity as its official faith or source of law. It also precludes Adventists from using faith as a cudgel, these are his words, or civic legislation to coerce other people. The principle of religious liberty, which is what the General Conference uses to monitor church activity around the world, is rooted in traditional Adventist theological teachings about the separation of church and state. Specifically, since the church's foundings in the 1860s, Adventists have anticipated a time in contemporary history when church members themselves will become othered and persecuted under civic state law. That expectation of future state persecution has understandably and appropriately checked the church's willingness to either seek civic power or use it to target other populations. But a closer look at the church's work yields a more mixed picture. And there are two highlights from the last 154 years that stood out to me when I looked back. One was a man named A.T. Jones's testimony to Congress in the 1880s. He was arguing to Congress that Congress should not allow a Sunday sacredness law. And he said that religious bigotry knows no such thing as progress or enlightenment. He also said that no man can allow any legislation on behalf of the religion or religious observances which he himself believes without forfeiting his own religious freedom. And then the second example would be from a temperance secretary in Louisiana, and that was in 1908. And they both appeal to religious liberty in terms of civil rights, not only in terms of sectarian theology. What's interesting about the Louisiana case is that this guy, he was willing to challenge Louisiana laws about alcohol consumption, which is a church tenet in the Adventist tradition. But he was also willing to allow the state to rule against mixed race marriages and mixed race sex. So he was willing to challenge state power against a thing that the church believed in, but he was also willing to accept state power on something that we now accept is immoral. So in the last 30 years, through the North America division, which serves the United States, Canada, Bermuda, and parts of Micronesia, the church in that region has mostly avoided public controversy on matters of civil law. Its staff members do engage civil rights topics indirectly, like through the public affairs and religious liberty offices or through friend of the court briefs at the Supreme Court level. So in cases like Hosanna Tabor, which dealt with what the church had to comply with the American Against Disability or American Disability Act, that was one case where the church spoke out. In cases like the Gavin Grimm case, which was about access for trans students to have access to the bathrooms, the church also spoke out in that case. But in these cases, the church is not really addressing the dignity of LGBTQIA people. They're only dealing with very narrow questions of law, and they've skipped over the theology or the ethics of how to engage us. So there have also been exceptions to that. So in 2004, the Religious Liberty Director of the Adventist Church in Canada argued that civil marriage for, quote, our neighbors who are struggling with immoral sexual inclinations was part of the greatest assault on religious freedom in recent memory. And then in California, as they were considering civil marriage equality, the General Conference's Administrative Committee issued a statement about same-sex unions. The Pacific Union publicly supported Proposition 8. The North Pacific Union Conference urged all state governments in the Northwest to reject any attempt to redefine marriage. And several years later, General Conference and North American Division staff members came to a local church in Maryland and promoted no votes on civil marriage referenda in 2 states. Outside the United States, the Southern African Union opposed South Africa's LGBTI-supportive constitution in 2006. It also opposed subsequent marriage equality in that country. As the gentleman earlier said to us, that was one of the first constitutions on the continent to protect civil citizens from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In 2011, administrators in the British Union used the church's official newsletter to encourage members to sign petitions against same-sex marriage in Britain. A union staffer called equality laws a personal challenge to Adventists. The BUC president alleged a nefarious LGBT strategy to desensitize the public. And finally, at the denomination's mostly heterosexuals only conference on gender and sexuality in 2014, which again occurred in South Africa, the General Conference's General Counsel made an about turn and proposed using civil law to benefit institutions rather than to benefit all people. And he told the delegates at that conference that denominational hiring and firing and church policy practice would be easier if more countries had criminalization than if fewer countries had it. So here in Jamaica, as you know, representatives of the Jamaica Union have repeatedly declared that LGBT civil rights are not human rights, and that the union stridently opposes repeals of the laws that we're discussing. So it may be surprising that when Uganda and other African states began to do this new cycle of criminalization, the General Conference spoke out against criminalization. Dwayne Leslie wrote that the Uganda anti-homosexuality bill was abhorrent and incomprehensible. He said that it was wrong to criminalize homosexuality and claimed that the denomination vehemently opposes governments passing legislation to compel morality. And this is linked again to the president's statements about not using state power to advance church interests. So, according to the General Conference president, it is against Adventist teaching to use the force of the civil state against other people, even if so doing appears to protect the church's institutional or legal interests. It is not against consistent church practice to decriminalize, but this is an area where, ironically, the General Conference and LGBT groups like SDA Kinship actually agree on the principle. So when they spoke up for LGBTQIA church members in East Africa this decade, SDA Kinship's communications team wrote that the criminalization of LGBTI people violates fundamental human rights. It is a vehicle for discrimination. It's contrary to the character of Jesus Christ and the value system that our church promotes. We are each part of the diverse human family, and God calls us to love one another, to love our neighbor as ourselves. That includes loving our LGBTI neighbors and not scapegoating them or ostracizing them or imprisoning them for consensual relationships. Regardless of the church's stance on human sexuality and gender roles, we believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church should never actively or passively promote the violation of basic human rights. So from my perspective, the open question for Adventism on this topic is how to go beyond sentiments of love, because everybody says that they love and everybody would like to be kind. How do we actually deal justly with others? Cornel West has said that justice is what love looks like in public. And perhaps this is especially true when parties disagree. So in his principles outlined in 2013, President Wilson outlined a way for the Adventist Church to move forward while honoring both its convictions and religious liberty in the most expansive way. And it's for all of us to wrestle with the implications of that in this context. Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I wanted to say how grateful I am to Maurice Tomlinson in particular for the invitation to speak. It really is an honour when there have been so many distinguished and very thoughtful speakers at this event. So my name is Matthew Waits. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Glasgow, where I'm involved in Glasgow Human Rights Network. And my research has included work on the Commonwealth, including a volume which I want to just highlight because it's an open access resource that is freely available online, and it has 2 chapters on Jamaica which are particularly strong, one of which also discusses the Bahamas and Trinidad and Tobago. These are by Philip Dale, Conway Blake, one of them, and Joseph Gaskins, the other, which I think I would love to talk to more, but I've been given the brief to speak to you about the Church of Scotland, the Scottish situation relative to the situation in England, to think about the differences between decriminalisation debates in England and Scotland. So that's what I'm going to do. I just briefly wanted to say, in all discussions about the Commonwealth, I think we need to look at the Commonwealth with a slightly, at least a slightly critical eye, maybe more through the lens that great Caribbean intellectuals like C.L.R. James or Stuart Hall would perhaps look at the Commonwealth, particularly in light of the Queen still being the head of the Commonwealth and the only person who signed the Commonwealth Charter. So we need to have a slightly critical and questioning view about the Commonwealth itself in light of North-South relations. So in this book, one of the central things we were doing was trying to do a comparative analysis to learn from different struggles in different states. And one of the central themes that emerged was the very important and often the very positive role that different churches can play in taking forward moral understandings in different contexts. So that's a theme, that's really a central theme of what I'm going to try to discuss about developments in England and Wales. So I'm speaking particularly to offer a historical perspective on the debates that led to decriminalisation in England and Wales in 1967 and a much later decriminalisation in Scotland in 1980. And just to mention that I myself was born and brought up in England, but I've lived in Scotland for 10 years, so I hope I'm reasonably well situated to discuss these issues. And clearly, in the context of colonialism, it's not possible to draw straightforwardly at all from these discussions the lessons in the Caribbean. But what we perhaps can say is that we do need to reflect on the internal power relations within the United Kingdom, and particularly the problem of English power over Scotland. So this may enable us to see certain resonances between how Scottish nationalism has been formed in association with certain moral understandings, and perhaps parallels between that and the post-colonial experience of Jamaica and other Commonwealth Caribbean states. So let me discuss first England, which we've heard quite a bit about, so I'm going to edit slightly as I go. In the academic literature, the most detailed and insightful discussion of the role of the Church of England that I've found comes in an article from the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, published in 2009 by Matthew Grimley from Oxford University, which is titled Law, Morality and Secularisation, the Church of England and the Wolfenden Report. And Grimley argues convincingly that the role of the Church of England in the reforms of the 1960s has been neglected in much of the academic literature. In particular, he highlights that the key role of the Church of England's Moral Welfare Council needs to be recognised in the early 1950s in prompting the creation of the Wolfenden Committee by a Conservative government from 1954. More specifically, the Church of England's Moral Welfare Council began investigating homosexuality after its study secretary, Anglican priest Derek Sherwin Bailey, wrote an article in the periodical Theology in 1952, which initiated a debate over the legal position of homosexuals. And we've already heard this in a previous talk. The Moral Welfare Council subsequently published a pivotal interim report in 1954 called The Problem of Homosexuality, which was a key influence on government, prompting the creation of the Wolfenden Committee. So Grimley notes that the initial report was widely cited by supporters of an inquiry, including the Sunday Times and Lord Bob Boothby, who became Home Secretary. So the Moral Welfare Council then went on to later submit a final report to the Wolfenden Committee, which was published in 1956 called Sexual Offenders and Social Punishment. So we can see then how at this time, for the authors of those Church of England reports, it was axiomatic that public and private morality, law and sin, should be separated. However, we must recognise that the Moral Welfare Council was not representative of wider Church of England opinion. We should also emphasise that these interventions were underpinned by a church view of homosexuality as a psychological condition of those seen as inverts, quote, handicapped by inversion, and homosexual acts were still seen as inherently sinful. Now, Grimley convincingly argues that existing histories of the reformist legislation of the 1960s, such as by Geoffrey Weeks, have overestimated the extent to which this responded to pressure from new social movements. And Grimley, on the other hand, argues that the existing literatures underestimated the positive role of the Church of England in initiating moral debate. Quote, the Church was prominent in a number of campaigns for legal reform on homosexuality, the abolition of the death penalty, and the rights of immigrants. Therefore, existing narratives need to be rethought, and Grimley shows that senior Anglicans were promoting a secularisation of the law. Now, for my purpose today, the central point to draw from this is the extent to which the Church of England's, and particularly its Moral Welfare Council, exercised positive creative agency in favour of decriminalisation from the very early in the 1950s. So this accentuates a contrast with Scotland, which I'm now going to draw. So in Scotland, decriminalisation legislation was only passed in 1980, coming into effect in 1981. In Scotland, there was fierce debate within the Church of Scotland after the Wolfenden report was published in 1957, but the outcome was clear that the Church was to oppose decriminalisation. And the Church of Scotland was rare among the major churches at that time in opposing the Wolfenden report. There have now been several studies discussing reasons for this difference and the discrepant role of the Church of Scotland relative to the Church of England. Roger Davison and Gail Davis have argued that opposition from the Scottish churches was one of the key reasons why decriminalisation occurred later in Scotland, with the others being a lack of appetite among Scottish politicians, opposition in some media institutions, and some specific differences in Scots law, which meant that consensual private acts had rarely been prosecuted in Scotland. My colleague Jeff Meek at University of Glasgow has provided the most sustained, in-depth analysis, thank you, of the reasons for Scottish difference in relation to England and Wales, especially in his recent 2015 book, which discusses gay and bisexual men's voices in post-war Scotland, using documentary sources and oral histories. Jeff Meek has emphasised that within the Wolfenden Committee that sat from 1954 to 57, the most prominent Scottish member was James Adair, and his negative attitude towards decriminalisation set the tone for the Scottish debates that followed. And Meek shows how the Church of Scotland endorsed and drew on Adair's distinctive Scottish analysis of the Wolfenden Report, which essentially argued that the distinct nature of Scottish society meant that it would be inappropriate to follow what was happening in the English context. He also notes that the Roman Catholic Church in England supported partial decriminalisation, while the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland made little comment. And the Free Presbyterian Church in Scotland was deeply opposed to decriminalisation. Where earlier commentaries have emphasised the pivotal role of the Church of Scotland in rejecting decriminalisation, Meek is somewhat more qualifying and places a bit more emphasis on the law, but he's still seeing the role of the Church of Scotland as very central. So, what I just want to turn to now is how the close study of what happened within the churches in Scotland shows how low-key engagements between lesbian and gay activists and figures in the church were occurring, you might say, behind the scenes in creative ways. So Meek shows how when the Scottish Minority Group was formed as a new group from 1969 to campaign for decriminalisation, it was engaging from the beginning with Church of Scotland figures. And Meek argues that by the late 1960s, there was proactive engagement. He argues that a member of the Church of Scotland's Moral Welfare Wing was liaising with the Scottish Minority Group. And one of the striking features of what emerges from Meek's research is that it reveals this disjunction between the official discourse of church leaders and the more accommodating practices of some junior ministers and church members. And this comes through particularly in the account of the Scottish Minorities Group, also in how it related to the Roman Catholic Church. And in particular, his research reveals that the Scottish Minorities Group was actually meeting in premises that belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. So they literally had a venue that was accessed by the church. And so this created a whole sort of quiet engagement context, which was creative and enabled dialogue to occur and new voices and approaches to emerge. So the point I would draw from this is our need to appreciate the complexity and diversity of relationships between members of church communities and members of LGBT communities. Now, just to bring this story up to date, in recent years, in 2013, the Church of Scotland's attitudes have shifted, and in 2013, the Church of Scotland voted to allow non-heterosexuals in civil partnerships to be ordained. So, just to finish on what we can learn from this and perhaps how this would relate to the Caribbean experience. The Caribbean feminist Jackie Alexander argued in a 1994 article called "Not Just Anybody Can Be a Citizen" that the context of decolonization led Caribbean nationalisms to be formed with an emphasis on the moral purpose and validity of the nation state. She suggested that this can help explain why many Caribbean states have maintained, or after decolonization, maintained much of English criminal law after independence, especially on sex offences, and also suggests that it partly explains more recent regulation on sexual offences. For example, in she talks about Trinidad and Tobago. So the problem here, as Alexander puts it, and I would agree, is that while legislation against sexual violence, for example, has obviously been desirable, homosexuality has in certain ways been tied into broader framings of sexuality. And so in this light, I would suggest that we can see something of a parallel between the ways in which Scottish nationalist projects sought to assert moral authority in the 1970s in a manner which delayed decriminalisation in Scotland until 1980, with some of the forms of nationalism that have emerged and been articulated with morality and Christianity in Caribbean states like Jamaica. Hence, the point to be made is that fundamentally, one doesn't need to criminalise homosexuality in order to have a moral ideal of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists. Now, you know, the problem with being the moderator is that you get slayed over and over again, right? So, because we need to get through one more panel, here is my suggestion for us going forward. I have taken up the questions that were given for the past two panels. Now, Maurice has agreed that tomorrow we can finish off the rest of the questions, since we had some questions from earlier today that we were not able to get to. But in fairness to these, I'm going to take the top 4 that I have here, because I took them in the order that I got them, and I'm going to read them out, right? Some of them are addressed specifically to panelists. I'm going to take 15 minutes. Let us just quickly do that, and then we move into the final session. The beauty of the final session is that we only have 3 speakers. All right? Do I need to ask everyone to stand and stretch? Do I have anybody who does yoga in here? Or do I need to ask for some soca? Because I know I have a technical department, a little reggae for us to stretch some legs. Yes. No? I think so. Yvonne is in the front here telling me yes. See, I like when people are really Yvonne needs to start it. You know what? I'm making a special request that tomorrow we have a little reggae playing, Maurice. And you sort it out. And advocating for my own needs, I'm asking for some soca as well. All right, maybe some back in time, some old time soca, you know. I see sorry. I see Marjorie in the back there stretching. All right, let's just go quickly, guys. I'm going to read this question, but I am also going to say that this question is not applicable to our session, but in fairness to the person who wrote it, we are taking questions that are applicable to the panel, the themes of the 2 panels, okay? It says, can anyone tell me what is the gay agenda and who crafted it? I'm sorry, but I did establish earlier as a moderator that we are taking questions based on the theme for the 2 panels we have, okay? Are there any other sins other than violence and homophobia? Are there any sexual sins? I'm struggling to read what was written here, sorry. Yeah, so it says, are there any other sins? Are there any sins other than violence and homophobia? Are there any sexual sins? Does anybody want to take any part of that question? Or would you prefer that very, very quickly?
I can say that in Roman Catholic moral theology discussions, and I know this is true of the wider Christian discussions as well, there's a different direction that moves from what's called act-based morality, where what is decided as good or bad is certain activities, and it's a movement towards relationship-based morality, which looks at what's good or bad about a relationship, that it's the quality of a relationship that we should judge good or bad. So that if there is no free consent in a relationship, or if there is a inequality of power in a relationship, then that would be a sinful, a sexual sin. But that we should move away from activity as the problem. The problem is the quality of the relationships.
Thank you, Reverend Sherry.
Yes, I just say as a good old-fashioned Protestant, drawing from Martin Luther for those who are out there like myself, sin literally is a separation from God. We are all sinners. There is no saints among us versus sinners. We are all sinners. And to quote Martin Luther, one of his better quotes, I think it was kind of punk rock of theology, he said, "Sin boldly and love Christ more boldly still." That, I think, is the kind of bedrock of Protestant Christianity, that we don't set ourselves over one to the other. We're not better than someone or worse than someone. We're all, as Oscar Wilde would say, lying in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the divine, to misquote.
Okay. We have established a little structure early on today. I'm just reminding persons, because there's some persons who came in after lunch, that we are taking written questions. So the questions that are here, so you can write your question. It doesn't mean it will be answered now. It may be answered tomorrow. Sorry? The question I just read? So I assume that you're the person who wrote this question. Okay, so this question had two parts, and I allowed the panelists to answer the parts that they wish to answer based on what they were asked to present on. No, I don't. Yes, you can actually, and if you can write it on a paper, we will add it to the list of questions. And I would like to take two questions that were actually from the previous panel. Is Reverend Zachariah here? Is he? Yeah. Oh, I couldn't see you. Sorry. I have a question coming up for you. And to the very Reverend Michael Weaver, this question is for you, and I'm going to hand you a mic. It says, what can be learned about strategies for human rights from other countries in South Africa, apart from South Africa? Southern. Guys, I'm just reading what is written here. Example, anti-discrimination employment laws, in Botswana, decriminalization in Mozambique. Do you want me to read it again, Craig?
Thank you. I have a very limited knowledge of what happens beyond South Africa. But most of countries in South Africa or Southern Africa are informed and guided by the more urban and the university-centered intellectual activity, but there's also a higher concentration of civil societies. And so maybe from there onwards we can look at it.
I'm going to ask this other questions for you, just very quickly, and then I'm going to move to the question for Rev. Zachariah. Again, South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions. Why then is the Anglican Church still behind with discrimination? I'm reading the question in fairness to the person who has written it. Rev, it's totally up to you.
I think that's a very important question that we're trying to answer. I think it's right that our constitution is where it is, that it's very progressive, that it emphasizes people's humanity, and it speaks to the whole thing of what we call Ubuntu, a person as a person because of other people. Having said that, the vanguard of progressiveness is often weighed up, and we are found wanting because as a church, we hadn't fully engaged in a way that other sectors of society has embraced our humanity. So we tend to lag behind. We tend to be more guided by cultural values than by, and even when we embrace theology and when we come to scripture, it's through a very mono lens of our own prejudice. And so we are finding that we are having to undo a lot of what is now accumulated post-1994, that we have become more ethnic driven, we become more tribalistic because of the way the operatives within government has found a shortcut through populism to get to people's hearts and minds. And it's the cheap vote that they secure, but the popular vote is the one that is quite corrupting of our society. And that's a challenge facing us as a church.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Michael. And very quickly, I'm asking Maurice to take the mic to the back for Reverend Zachariah. This is the last question we take right now in the interest of time. For Reverend Zachariah, what was some of the faiths involved in the interfaith dialogue or declaration read from? I'm just reading what's here. What were some of the faiths involved in the interfaith dialogue that you spoke of earlier today?
You mean the religious communities?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So there were representatives from Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, and Jainism.
Okay.
Along with Christians.
Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
And while the panel makes its way up, may I just do a little process check and workshop. I feel like you're tired, and there is another panel. You do have the option to have that panel in the morning or have it now. What will you like? Have it now. You have it now? Okay, great. All right. It's only 2 persons.
You can go to midnight.
Listen, midnight is no longer my glass of wine.
So just to advise, we are only having 2 persons for this panel. Horace Levy is going to be presenting because we have not been able to get confirmation from one of the panelists. And Reverend Dr. Zachariah presented before. Reverend G-Day will also be presenting tomorrow, and so he has graciously agreed to combine his talks so that we will be able to get through today. So we'll just have Horace Levy and Reverend Marjorie, or Reverend Dr. Marjorie.
All these people who hijack the mic. All these hijackers, really, guys, come on. All right, so we're continuing on the same trend while I allow our panelists to have a seat. We are, again, looking now, same theme, other churches and decriminalization, but we're looking at it from the Global South perspective, yeah? And again, while we settle, please write your questions on the nice pages that Maurice is offering you. We may not be able to take all, but I will accommodate a few at the end. And again, panelists, we have 2, so we have 10 minutes each, which may allow us for at least 10, 12 minutes of Q&A after. All right? Do I really need to do yoga? Are we good? We're good? Yeah. All right, there we go. Anyone? Sure. Or would you like a mic? You can use a mic. You can use a mic. She says ethnic fatigue.
You can't use the N word anymore, you know. That's not right. So,
Friends, good afternoon. I want to thank Maurice and Sean and all the others involved in the planning of this conference for inviting me. And to thank all of you for your presentations and your presence. This is just wonderful. I'm a believer in dialogue, as you will hear as I go along. So we're looking at decriminalization, and I have only 10 minutes. So I'm going to be coming at it from a different angle than I think has been raised before. The first thing I want to establish is my standpoint. I'm not neutral, and I'm not speaking for the whole world. I'm coming at it from my perspective as a minister of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, currently based in Canada, where I'm undertaking research on ministerial formation with special reference to clinical pastoral education and the competence to offer spiritual care to diverse individuals and groups. My focus is on LGBTIQ and interfaith, because I've been kind of around the block with gender and class and race. So those two, I feel I have less
experience with, and therefore I'm trying to learn. I'm in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with a number of hats, including visiting scholar at the Atlantic School of Theology, which is great. I speak from my experience of hearing and or participating in conversation on LGBTIQ matters for approximately 20 years. I think an important marker was between 1997 and 2002 when I was based in the United Kingdom. Yes, for all the Brits. You can bring me a nice breakfast fry up and fish and chips, scampi and chips actually anytime. There I went as a missionary to work in race relations. That's a whole other story. But I arrived to work in race relations as a missionary to the United Reformed Church at precisely the time when the URC was describing, as the British put it, you know, British are very good at euphemism, the human sexuality debate, which really was about ordination of practicing gay men. So that was a very important moment for me to listen to this debate, and on one occasion to be invited through the moderator of the synod in which I was based to preach on Mother's Day at the Gay, Black and Lesbian Christian Fellowship. So as has already been mentioned, the whole question of intersectionality, what it means to be Black, gay, and so on. And what I would say about that is that I was struck by the fact that the Black section of the church, and particularly the Black gay people, were frozen out of the white gay lobbies and marginalized because a lot of people in the Black community said, we don't have gay people. So it became fascinating for me to interface with this, and I had to deal with the question, well, what do I do when I'm invited to preach at the Black, Gay and Lesbian Christian Fellowship? Coming back to UTC into Jamaica afterwards, we, under the leadership of the late President, Dr. Lewin Williams, Dr. Williams recognized that the Caribbean has the second highest prevalence for HIV and AIDS behind sub-Saharan Africa. Sorry. And headhunted the Reverend Dr. Evie Vernon to pioneer work with the students. So since 2004, all the UTC students have been trained as specialist VCT counselors, because his view was that training people in the Caribbean required relevance. And since that was a major issue, we had to deal with that. So UTC not only trained its own students, but trained people at Jamaica Theological Seminary, International University in the Caribbean, anywhere else, anybody else. So this was the program set up by Ministries of Health in the Caribbean at Johns Hopkins University. And one of the outcomes of that work was a publication. I'm sorry, Father Minot is not here. He heads the HIV program. But a book of liturgies was developed with the help of Musa Dube, actually, who some of you would know, Professor Musa Dube, who has worked from Botswana, who came and ran a workshop for us to develop liturgies. So there is now a book of liturgies produced through the United Theological College of the West Indies that offer ideas about how anti-discrimination messages can be embedded in liturgies at different points in the Christian calendar for different rites and passage. So then we ended up, well, that's how I met Robert and other such people, because suddenly we are doing HIV and AIDS counseling. Well, guess what? We have to say, how do we deal with all permutations of how people have sex? So discussion started about what is the nature of spiritual care with the gay community. And I will deal with that tomorrow because I want to focus on pastoral care and spiritual care and some of the implications. I was then invited to a meeting in Ghana which was mainly Presbyterians from across the continent, met in Ghana, academics, through the Akrofi Christella Center, and with support from Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta. And then some of us waifs and strays kind of got hitched on the wagon. But it was exciting for me. There was only one identified gay person in the group, a lesbian woman from South Africa. It was very nice, actually. White lesbian from the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. And there were academics and church leaders, mainly from the continent, who prepared and presented papers on exegesis, both for and against ordination and so on. But what excited me is that we were able to live in the same space, talk together, put forward different positions, cry if we were upset, but nobody left. We were all able to engage that discussion and some very difficult issues. Then Indonesia. The seminary in Indonesia has about a 20-year history working with the LGBTIQ community. And they had a conference on the church and homophobia somewhere around 2014. Again, I got hitched onto that wagon. So that was very interesting to see how a seminary had not only developed a response, a pastoral approach to responding to the needs of the LGBTIQ community, but was able to invite mainly people from Asia, activists, theologians, academics, to talk about the church and homophobia, largely in Asia. And then I've been in Canada, and I attend an affirming congregation of the United Church of Canada, which is quite exciting. So I attempt to sing on the choir, but I have to say the choir is so good. All I have to do is tell about mine, and I sound fantastic. So that's an interesting space to be. And as already mentioned, there are some international involvements I have, including the World Council of Churches reference group on human sexuality, which we are striving manfully and womanfully under to, you know how it is, orthodox, this, that. So life gets exciting. Now I need to make it clear that what I have to say is not the official position of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. I'm a good girl, so my General Secretary knows I'm here. But I'm not speaking for the United Church, which at this point has no written document on decriminalization. I would say the nearest I have seen in terms of a position of the church is a paper put out by the Jamaica Council of Churches some time ago, which basically says the mainline churches do not agree with homosexual relationships, but think there is a duty of pastoral care that has to be taken seriously. So, just quickly, how many minutes I have now? About 5 left?
Too short does not want to give you the 2.
You must be mad. So, I will quickly table some things with you. I've been thinking about what does the Reformed tradition have to offer to this debate? And what are some of the issues with respect to theological education and formation? So, as part of the Reformed tradition, I think the matter of the priesthood of all believers and the chucking out of the bishops, no disrespect to all the people in the room, but the whole point was that individual disciples of Jesus Christ must exercise some agency in the development of their theological positions. This is not very comfortable all the time in my church, right? But that is the Reformed position. So I think that this gives us an important tool coming out of the Reformed tradition in terms of how we approach decriminalization and other justice issues. There must be dialogue, but there must be responsibility for one's own theological development and some agency in doing the research, doing the thinking, to come to an informed position of conscience. The United and Uniting churches, too, have a commitment to diversity within the same denomination that I think we in Jamaica probably need to think about a little bit more deeply. So, for example, the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands has 2 forms of baptism. Now, you know, WCC can't even discuss this. Never mind baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. But the combination of traditions includes infant baptism and believers' baptism, and both are practiced currently within the United Church. So we quarrel and we're not all comfortable and so forth, but we're not going anywhere. There's an interesting case I want to share with you on the question of living with diversity within the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. And that is, 2 years ago, the government proposed a change in the legislation on abortion. They wanted to decriminalize abortion in specific instances, mainly rape, incest, danger to the life of the mother, and so on. The then General Secretary of the United Church, Reverend Dr. Colin Cowan, made a presentation to the Joint Select Committee supporting the proposed legislation, and then sent me along to answer the questions in Parliament. Well, we also had people within the same church, within the congregation that I worship in, putting counter proposals before the Parliament and joining in the so-called pro-life march. So we had these discussions. We were in the same denomination, in the same congregation. We disagreed fundamentally, and none of us have gone anywhere. We're sitting there and duking it out. So I feel that within the United Church, we have some traditions and some recent experiences that we can capitalize on. The United Church within the last 2-3 years has been very prolific in putting out policies to deal with justice issues internally, such as a gender policy framework, where we did an analysis of gender relations with a view to mainstreaming gender within the church. There has been a policy on disability and looking at making everything accessible. There has been a child protection policy, and there has also been work with our reformed colleagues in the region on human trafficking. There has also been a willingness of the leadership of the church to release clergy and laity for research and specialist formation. So myself and another colleague have been released to pursue our interests in clinical pastoral education and general ministerial formation. And I think it's also important what the United Church did not do, which is that it did not break relationships with other members of the Reformed tradition who have ordained gay clergy or had same-sex or will bless same-sex marriages, whereas there are other partners from the Global South who felt that they wanted to break relationships because of the decisions that were taken. All right, so 2 minutes on ministerial formation, and then I'll finish. I think we need to ask ourselves, what kind of minister and what kind of disciple do we want in the church now and for the future? And who receives theological education and formation? I believe it should be both the leadership and the laity. And as I said, I'm not coming at this from any kind of objective thing. I'm a Caribbean womanist theologian. Intersectionality is very important for me. And as a practical theologian, I'm heavily influenced by the work of Paul Affair. Somebody mentioned bell hooks. I can't remember who it was. And I said, oh, that was another place, but I like bell hooks, right? I feel, based on that perspective, that the question of dialogue is very important. And one of the discussions that the Canadian colleagues have been having is about the role of qualitative research and clinical pastoral education in ministerial formation. And for some Doctor of Ministry programs, one piece of qualitative report is very important, research, because both qualitative research and clinical pastoral education have aspects of formation for listening. Listening to what people are really saying, what their body is telling you, what their tone is saying, what the silences are saying. And there have been discussions about how it is that these exercises and these academic exercises can help in the formation of the capacity of church leaders to listen and to enter into dialogue. I believe also that advocacy is an important role of both the leadership and the laity. And that requires, in good Freudian things, conscientization and ability to think critically. The action reflection model. And the question is, what's the scope now of ministry and mission? If we don't want the colonial way, what are we supposed to do now? As I mentioned, spiritual care, I'll talk a little bit more about it. Another area I think we need to look at is diversity training. At UTC, when I was there was an attempt by the faculty to mainstream 4 perspectives in each course. I don't think we managed it all the time or consistently, but it was felt that rather than just have lectures or short workshops about something, how could we mainstream it? So, gender, disability, Caribbean, post-colonial, and ecumenical perspectives were the 4 we agreed on to start. So that would include things like, what are the textbooks that you use? Are they only Protestant, or do you have some Orthodox and some Roman Catholic? If you are doing hermeneutics, are you looking at what blind theologians are saying, gay theologians are saying, and so forth? And certainly, I'm going to finish now, certainly for Britain and Canada, there has been a tradition of racism awareness training. But I am not so sure we have done the same kind of work with LGBTIQ or interfaith work, right? So this is something for me now. How do we really train people, sensitize people to have these conversations and to understand what is happening? I'm fascinated with the reparations in Canada, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and the fact that certainly the United Church of Canada, in its seminaries, now as part of the reparations, is teaching First Nations culture and spirituality. And I've been wondering, as a Caribbean church, do we have some things we need to apologize for and repair, particularly when it comes to African culture and spiritualities? So I will close with some questions. How many justice issues can one denomination deal with? Because I think my denomination is in overload right now, between the gender, the disability, all kinds of things. So there's a practical issue. If you're going to take on decriminalization or any other justice issue, how many can one space deal with at the same time? And what's the capacity of a congregation or a denomination to really work through these issues? I'm also questioning dialogue. Can we open up dialogue partners? Of course, I harassed my church, so I said, well, why can't we open up an endeavor process with the United Church of Canada and look at LGBTIQ issues and human trafficking? Because Canada also has issues around human trafficking. And in Halifax, that's an important center. So that's part of my harassment. What questions should be addressed ecumenically as against just, or in addition to just what happens within denominations? And my final question is a curriculum one. I've given you some things that I think are interesting. But what curriculum is required to prepare leaders and laity for ministry and mission in the current context and for the future as we read the signs of the times in our local and global context? Thank you.
Afternoon, folks. I'm a late addition, yes. First upon you, by certain people. I only issued my own very warm welcome. You folks from foreign, as we say. I emphasize warm because that place here is so cold. Anyway, I welcome you, really. When I decided some months ago to take part in this conference, it was with a great deal of hesitation, which is part of why I'm here. It was out of personal interest on 2 grounds. One, because our law, even as framed verbally, is so close to the scripture. And I thought I knew a little bit about scripture until I heard Archbishop Holder this morning I'm thoroughly disabused of the notion I know anything about scripture. So it was out of personal interest. I had no intention of representing anybody, which was foolish of me because I'm the director of a body which won't mean anything to you folks from foreign, Jamaicans for Justice, but those locally, some love us and some hate us, so it will mean something to them. And I had some training in theology years ago, which is why I thought I knew something. I was a Jesuit in another life, beyond life. But I moved more into social work, crime and violence in my later years. So I welcome this conference because I saw it as coming from international church, as hopefully nudging our local leaders in the direction of decriminalizing intercourse between consenting adults of the same sex. And of course, this is exactly what the churches here, those who are in favor of decriminalization, fear. The truth is, as those of you who share my views will understand and recognize and accept, that the rights of lesbian and gay people are thoroughly violated by the criminalization. Sexuality is so central to the human person that an orientation, sexual orientation, to be denied or frustrated strikes at the very heart of the identity of that person, and therefore violates the most serious violation of their rights. And it's this, even as that identity and that right is being demeaned by being reduced to the sexual act, because those who are against it and so on tend to regard the sexual orientation as purely or mainly the sexual act, where there's so much else in the human person that there is. Of course, the assumption in what I just said is that the homosexual orientation is not chosen but something that people find themselves with. It's supposed unnaturalist, expressly stated in Jamaican legislation, stems from the obvious physiology of males and females and the mutual attraction between them. Of course, this is just common sense. For us, there is we're open-minded. The reality is that there is a minority, a certain percentage of the human population that has a different attraction. In other words, that human nature has now a wider connotation than it did before, than others. It's inclusive. It includes diversity, and minorities have always been objects of suspicion, hostility, and even cruel repression. It's the same common sense view of the natural and the unnatural that lies behind Paul's denunciation of homosexual acts, and so on. But common sense has a very poor record whenever it has come in conflict with science, as those of us who remember Galileo and Copernicus recognize that even today, evolution is still not accepted in certain church quarters, as we all recognize. The fact is that this orientation is something that's developed, come on the scene only within the last 150 or 200 years, and therefore to attribute this to the condemnation of homosexual acts in the Bible is entirely misplaced. One last comment in my brief presentation is that it's not just the opinion of psychologists and psychologists which make us recognize that that there isn't any psychological or mental illness involved. It's a simple testimony of good and sincere people about their personal experience, which many church leaders refuse to acknowledge. But in that connection, I'm reminded of the common criticism that Jesus made in John's Gospel, chapter 5. He's quoted as describing the leaders of the synagogue in those days. He says, "You study the scriptures diligently, supposing that in them, having them, you have eternal life. their testimony points to the need that you refuse to come to me to receive that right. Where do we find Jesus today, if not in the people, good and upright, in everywhere? The church, some of its leaders, shuts its eyes and its ears to them. It's in them that you find loving partners. Right? Sex is not in the first place for procreation, but for unity. It's out of the unity in a man or a woman that a child is born. That same physical unity, emerging from or and leading on to true love, can occur as much in the homosexual relation as in the heterosexual.
Amen.
On that note, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Oh, so good. Thank you very much. You know, I find it a difficult position to be in because we have heard so much today. We have absorbed so much today. There's a lot of food for thought. There are a lot of questions that we're walking away with. And we're kind of running short on the day, right? So here's what I'm suggesting that we do. I only got 2 questions during this panel. I'm going to take the 2 questions again in fairness to the persons who... Was there another one that I missed?
Yes, just came.
Oh, it's just, can you give it to me? Because in fairness to these 3 questions. Okay, guys, I struggle. All right, I'm going to read the question. I also want to remind us that in the same way we had lunch and break to have more opportunities for conversation, one-on-one with persons with whom we have questions. I want to encourage that for after this session. And I also, for those who are coming back tomorrow, you can continue the conversations with individuals, all right? I'm going to read the question. It quotes 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 11 says, do not be deceived. The sexually immoral and homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God. And that is what some of you were. If we then say homosexuality is not a sin, are we not deceiving homosexuals into hell? Hannah, it's totally up to you if you want to comment on any aspect of that as it pertains to what you wanted to present on.
Okay. The question about sin is a deep one that we can't all go into. We can't exhaust today. There's another formulation that I probably would offer, which is the world, the flesh, and the devil. Right? That's another classification of the kind of scope of missing the mark or sins. But somehow, although the content analysis of the Gospels shows Jesus speaking mostly about the kingdom of God and next about money and the related power relations, somehow contemporary Christians tend to be more in sexual sins.
Amen.
So I think that's interesting. But traditionally, coming through church history, the world, the flesh, and the devil have been the kind of big one way of classifying sins. So it's not simply sex. And I don't know why, but it may be interesting for us to figure out why sexual sin is what is prominent, and some of the immorality in the financial sector, in ethics, etc., which is not just between 2 consenting adults, but is disenfranchising large sections of the population, don't seem to get the energy and the commitment to work for justice as the question of homosexuality, and not just even all sexual sins, because there's fornication and there's adultery and there's all kinds of things. So, you know, I think that is it. The other thing I want to say is that we cannot judge. One of the interesting things that was mentioned by Archbishop Holder and others was that how Jesus judged the people who were considered to be sinning sexually was not the same way that the society did in his day. And there's an interesting thing, I think it's in the Anglican liturgy. I'll have to come out and let you know that the first 10 years of my life were spent in Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, right? So, but there is an interesting part of the funeral liturgy, I think it is in the Anglican one, where mention is made of the thief. To remember the departed, you know, as Jesus on the cross said to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise. So none of us is in a position to judge who is going to get to the kingdom and who is not going to get to the kingdom. And if you look at the parables of the kingdom, it suggests that we're going to have some surprises. Amen. So as far as I understand the scripture, conversion is the work of the Holy Spirit. And the judgment, the final judgment, belongs to God and is not always obvious to us through our human eyes.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
I'm all for the dialogue. But of course, I come with my perspective to the dialogue. My perspective is that homosexual acts are not sinful. And therefore, where the Bible says there's sin, so the Bible says that slavery is okay too.
Amen.
And other things that the Bible says.
Amen.
No, it's not a matter of the Bible not mattering, but the Bible has a central message which is love, which is more important than these particular denunciations.
I'm sorry, excuse me, I am the moderator. For everyone who has turned around, I am the moderator for this session, and therefore I will be
I'm
the
making
one.
a comment, and so let me finish my comment please, before you intervene.
Horace, can you just give me a second, please, Horace, as well? Again, I am the moderator and I am taking my privilege. This is why I am here. Respectfully to everyone, every single person in this room, this is not the kind of engagement that we're asking for. We're not in Parliament. We're not in a Conference Spring Market or downtown where we're throwing words. This is not the kind of engagement we're here for. And I am consistently asking for respect. I'm one person who doesn't deal with disrespect very well, and I'm one person who believes in inclusivity and open, constructive dialogue, guys. Horace, I would like you to finish your point, please.
My notion of dialogue is that each person is allowed to speak.
Oh, you have to put your mic on, Horace.
Sorry. My notion of dialogue is that each person is allowed to speak and be listened to before the other person intervenes. And then after that person is finished, and the other person has a chance to speak.
Agreed,
So
Horace.
agree or disagree.
Agreed.
So, from my perspective, it's not sin. I'm for dialogue, but I'm also tend to get impatient, right? We want some action as well as just talk. And so it's nice to have the church being nice to gay people, but it's not good enough, is what gay people say, right? We want to recognize that we have our rights, the gay people do. Even though I'm not one of them, I share that view. I come out of the Roman Catholic tradition. I'm not in it anymore. I'm actually in the United Church. Believe it or not, right? For the last 5 or 6 years, because I got, first of all, the RCs are hung up on sects, and so some other church people. And that's obvious, so very, very obvious that it's not funny anymore. And we need to get beyond that. So, so that's my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Horace. You know, for anyone who's ever been in a session with me. Oh, the last question you really wanted? Yeah. All right, the last question. Sorry, I actually forgot how to have a question, sorry. But is it really for you, Marjorie? Will the United Church in Jamaica ordain, I hope this is what I see here, ordain an openly gay or lesbian person? If so, when?
At this point, as far as I'm aware, the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands has no policy to ordain a gay person. I thought I made that clear. So I was not speaking for the United Church, and as I mentioned before, the nearest I've seen to policy for the United Church is the Jamaica Council of Churches statement, which I think is where most of the mainline churches are at right now, that they do not endorse same-sex relationships. However, they feel there's a duty of care, pastoral care, and sensitivity to working with the LGBTIQ community. As I said, tomorrow I want to talk some more about that, because I think first principle of pastoral care or spiritual care is do no harm. Right? It's do no harm. So certainly where I would put my foot down is that conversion therapy is just out.
Oh, thank you.
Exodus, the very head of Exodus, who promoted conversion therapy, is on record as saying it doesn't work. So I believe that the DSM removal of same-sex relationships from some kind of pathology is important. And I tell you why. I'm black and I'm female. Amen. We have been pathologized. Psychology has said in the past that black people who run away from slavery have something called drapetomania. And women were classified all kinds of ways in so-called psychology, and they dress it up with Latin, nice Latin sounding terms. So for those of us who have not been, come from traditions where we have not been the dominant section of society, there has been a history in philosophy, in religion, in medicine that says that we are less than, and that pathologizes black people, women, and therefore I have to embrace the hermeneutic of suspicion. When the same kind of hermeneutic that was made to tell me I shouldn't be free, I should keep silent in the church, is now being used in the case of the LGBTIQ community. So I just want to put that on the table.
So thank you very much, Marjorie and Horace. We really appreciate your comments. Before I invite Father Sean to do the 3-minute, you all heard me say 3-minute, right? Okay, yeah. The 3-minute wrap up, 3 minutes, yeah. I want us to just take a moment, because I saw a lot of persons writing, a lot of persons with their notebook. I want us to just take a moment and write, just in a bullet point, what was your one main takeaway from everything you heard today? And if you want, I would ask that Maurice passes around with the people, because I would love to collect those and kind of read them at some point tomorrow, openly. I'm asking it because we have been processing so much, and we're here for a dialogue to talk about what next. When we leave this room, guys, in our own spaces, what are we going to do next? And we have learned so much from other persons in different countries and different regions. So please take a moment and write, what is your one takeaway? It could be 2, it could be 3. That's fine, totally up to you. Bullet points. What is your one, or what are your 1 or 2 takeaways from today's session? And please, if you are open to sharing it, to give it to Maurice, we will collect it separate from the questions, and we will take an opportunity tomorrow to verbalize them. All right? Maurice is passing on around with 3 people. Okay, so let me invite Father Sean. You just want to do logistics too? Okay, very quickly, logistical issues before he gets his 3 minutes. You have the evaluation, guys, in nice orange sheets that are on your chairs. You're probably sitting on them, they're probably on the ground. They are open seats with the forms, so you can take them. That's one. Please, please, please fill them out. Please leave them with us. So the evaluation forms are very, very important. Please fill them out. Maurice is passing around my little minion today. Great. And the other thing, just very quickly, guys, there's going to be a bus here at 5:45 for the persons who want to go back to the hotel. So just giving you that marker, which is why we want to wrap up. And there will be another bus, Maurice, you said at 7:45? At 7:45 to take Christmas back to the hotel. So there are 2 bus times, guys, 5:45 and 7:45. Pick your bus as well. All right, I am going to give Sean his 3 minutes, and then I will take it over for a minute after.
Before the 3 minutes start, I just wanted to say that if your most important takeaway was listening to Yolanda, you may also write her name on the paper. You know, yesterday one of the things I shared with the media was the fact that when we talk about Jesus's new commandment of love, it is not about a group of persons of like mind going into the same room and holding hands and singing, "They'll know we're Christians by our love." Instead, it is persons from all walks of life with different views, different approaches, coming together and respectfully listening to each other. One of the things I am just so happy about, feeling proud about, is that, you know, ever since we started to talk about putting this conference together, we have been trying to find persons who would be willing to not just attend the conference, but to come on as panelists with different views. And so, you know, Maurice would call me or inbox me or email me to say, "Did you find a pastor? Did you check so-and-so?" And I kept saying, "No, but I think I will get through. No, but so-and-so and so-and-so and so," until we got to the point I was talking about long before summer. And then we got to the point where we agreed that, okay, even if it is not somebody with a theological, you know, formal theological training, we will go with that just to facilitate different views being presented at the table and at the status of panelists. Lo and behold, that still did not happen. It is our hope that next time, if persons are interested, they will accept the invitation. Invitations were sent out, invitations were made by telephone, by email, by WhatsApp, inbox. There were even persons who I saw them in the public space in social media on Facebook. And I used that particular public space to say, "I've been trying to get through to you just to let you know a cordial welcome awaits you if you so desire to share in this context." Nobody accepted. Yes, so just to share that with you, today has been a wonderful day, hasn't it? Yes. And it was wonderful to have the various panelists, the wonderful work done by, boy, I don't know, we need to clone Carol and Yolanda. Excellent work. To keep her, make sure that she keeps calm, you know, we have to give her different things to drink. That's Yolanda. And so we will hope for the best for tomorrow. Up on your coffee before you come. Spiritual things. Yes, she likes spiritual things. It has been wonderful. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the evening. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise God, all creatures here below. Praise God above the heavenly hosts. Praise God the Son and Holy Ghost.
Guys, remember that registration starts at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and we are starting here promptly at 8:30 a.m. to encourage a lot more conversation and discussions.
And the questions that we didn't get to today will be addressed tomorrow. Father Sean is going to deal with them before we have the first panel, as many of them as we can get through. So thank you all for sending your questions. We will be answering your questions. We just don't have the time.
Can we have confirmation of the bus time for tomorrow morning?
Very good question. Philip, bus time tomorrow morning. This is for the persons who are staying at the hotel. 7:30 in front. So Audley will be coordinating it as always. So I think he says a bus will pick some people up at the Knoxville, there people staying at other hotels, and he will bring them in cars to be at the central point. So be ready be ready at the latest 7:30 and don't say when you're locked. Alright? And if you have any doubts, please feel to reach out to us.
A little ragged tomorrow, guys. We're getting a little ragged tomorrow.
I'll collect,
Guys, I'm collecting takeaways.
If you
Do not
receive
leave with the
an invitation for later, for the event following this, if you receive an invitation for the event following this, please proceed to the end of the hall. If you receive an invitation for the event following this, please proceed.
Thank you, Dad.
Takeaways, evaluation form.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so you can see it.
Oh, there's a party.
Mark, are you coming?